This week's video is going to be a simple one, and I'm going to talk about why I think distilled water or reverse osmosis water is the best reducer you could use for acrylic paint in an airbrush. There are plenty of reducers on the market made for airbrush paints like 4012 Reducer and 4011 Reducer, both made by Createx. But for all of my paintings, I only use Createx illustration colors with distilled water or reverse osmosis water. I've used 4011 and 4012 Reducer for years and years until finally switching over to distilled water. And not only do I find it better to use for erasing techniques, it's also way cheaper, and more importantly, it's safer because it doesn't have any chemicals in it. Since I usually paint for 4 to 8 hours every single day, safety in the studio has become very important to me. So the first thing I'm doing here is mixing up 3 reduced paints, and this paint for all 3 is Cobalt Blue by Createx Illustration. The first 2 mixtures were reduced by 30%. The first one was reduced with 4012 Reducer, and the second one is reduced with the distilled water. And this final mixture is an over-reduced paint of about 30 drops distilled water to around 10 drops of paint. According to the technical data sheet from Createx, they recommend allowing about 10 minutes for the reducer and the paint to kind of acclimate. So before I started painting, I allowed these to sit for 15 minutes. While spraying through an Iwata Micron, these all spray very similar to me. All a reducer ever does is dilute the paint. In no way does it affect the pigment size, which is the most important part of a high quality airbrush paint. High quality brands like Createx, Golden, and Comart paints do a great job at grinding down those pigments so they're able to spray through a very small nozzle. All a reducer ever does is extend the vehicle within the paint mixture. The simplest way to think about an acrylic paint is to think of 3 major parts: the pigment, the binder, and the vehicle. The pigment is what gives the paint its color or hue. These are solid materials that need to be milled to a certain size to spray through an airbrush nozzle. There's a ton of different pigments that are used in different types of paints like oils, acrylics, and watercolors. And these range from natural to synthetic, and you'll hear terms like organic and inorganic. But to keep this video short and simple, all you have to know is that pigments give their paint their hue, which is their color. The binder is essentially what holds the pigments in place and dries to a solid film. Acrylic paints use an acrylic polymer like PMMA, while traditional oil paints will use an oil like linseed or walnut oil. But the interesting thing about acrylic paints is that they use a vehicle in their mixture. The vehicle carries and suspends the pigment and the binder. And in modern acrylic paint, the vehicle is water. So as soon as the acrylic paint is sprayed from the airbrush, it's exposed to the atmosphere, which causes the water in it to evaporate from the mixture. Once this water is gone from the emulsion, the acrylic polymers can now come together, forming a stable hexagonal structure. And this stable structure, which holds the pigments, is what we call dried paint. So once the water is removed, all you have are acrylic polymers, which are fused together, and pigment, which is the color or the hue, trapped inside. When you use water to reduce the paint, you're extending the vehicle, meaning that the paint is now going to dry slower. This also reduces the binder's ability to fuse together, creating a weaker bond in the final paint film. So what does this mean for us as airbrush painters? Well, it just makes it a lot easier to erase. Now this is difficult to demonstrate on a YouTube video, but when I erase into this over-reduced paint, it comes out so easily with very little pressure. On this one, which was diluted less with water to about 30%, it's about the same. I'm using slightly more pressure here to pull out the paint. And on this final one, which was reduced with 4012 Reducer, the paint is a lot stronger. Again, it's hard to show, but I'm using a lot more pressure here to pull out the paint. Since 4012 Reducer is alcohol based, it reduces the drying time. So this paint's going to dry and then eventually cure a lot quicker than it will with water. For my style of painting and the things I do on this channel, this is a bad thing because I want that paint to remain open as long as possible so that I can erase into it and manipulate it. And this paint has been drying for just over 4 hours. On the right side of the screen, you can see that the over-reduced paint atomized much better than the other ones. The edges are a lot softer and you don't have that graininess that you see in the other two. But the major problem with over-reduced paint is that the final film is very unstable. Even if I let this dry for a month, if I sprayed some water on it, the paint would start dissolving. But the solution for this is very simple. All you need to do is spray an acrylic polymer over the top of this once the painting is complete and let that dry. And that acrylic polymer that we spray over the top is what some people call a clear coat and what some others call a permanent varnish. My favorite acrylic polymer to spray over the top is made by Liquitex. And what this stuff essentially is a paint mixture without any of the pigments in it. So once the water evaporates out, this acrylic polymer dries to a transparent film. This film is permanent and seals all the paint and the layers underneath. And I'd like to point out that in the technical data sheet provided by Createx, they also say that you could use deionized or distilled water to thin your paint. It also mentions that over-reducing can result in loss of adhesion and extended drying times, which I completely agree with. So if you decide to use water as a reducer like I do, make sure that you're using deionized or distilled water. This is very important. I'll show you why. This small device is called a TDS meter, which stands for total dissolved solids. When you place this in a liquid like water, it measures the dissolved combined content of all organic and inorganic matter. This number is represented in parts per million, and pure water will have 0 total dissolved solids in it. Now, if I place this TDS meter in some tap water, you're going to see that the number is much higher. Every water source is going to be different. I live in New York and God knows what's in this water. And you can see that this number is about 220 parts per million. So in other words, it has a lot of organic and inorganic substances in it, and you just don't want to mix that with your paint. You want the vehicle in your paint, which is water, to be as clear and as clean as possible. So the easiest way to do this is to pick up a bottle of distilled water. You could buy these for $1, $1.50 at any grocery store. My recommendation is Deer Park distilled water because when I measure this, I get a TDS of 0, which is really great. Most brands, like if you buy a cheaper one for 50 cents, you'll notice that it has some dissolved solids in it, usually around 10 or 15, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But this Deer Park brand has 0, which is excellent. Since I use so much water in my paintings and for cleaning the airbrush afterwards, I actually bought myself an RODI system. RODI stands for Reverse Osmosis Deionized Water. And what a system like this allows you to do is hook it up to your tap water and filter it out to get pure 0 TDS water. I think a system like this is overkill for most people, but since I use it so much, I found this to be very convenient, and I have deionized water, which is basically better than distilled water, with me at all times. The way I like to use it is in this slop sink where I clean my paintbrushes, and that first hose I place into the drain, that's the wastewater, and this other one is pure deionized water. I just place this hose in an empty 1-gallon container, and in about 10 to 15 minutes, it's ready to go. This RODI system that I use is a small, portable one, and it's 4-stage made by Aquatic Life. I've had this for about 3 years. I haven't changed the filters yet. It works great and it's pretty inexpensive, so I'll have a link for it down below. These are really cool to have and it makes it convenient, but again, I don't think it's really necessary for most people. So the best and easiest thing you could do is head to your grocery store and just pick up a gallon of distilled water. Now, I want to point out that using distilled water as a reducer is the best method for my style of painting. This is not going to work for everyone. It's definitely something you don't want to do if you're doing custom painting, like painting on cars. You should always use the reducer that the company supplies with their paint. But if you're painting fine art on canvas or on paper, I find this to be a great solution. And then to seal it up at the end by spraying that varnish over the top. Not only does it work better for me, but it's also safer because there's none of the chemicals that are in those other reducers. I understand that not everyone is going to agree with this method, and just because the technique that I use doesn't mean that it's the correct or the right technique. And if you use something different, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear what other people use for their airbrush paintings. But the last thing I want to say is that I would never recommend using ammonia or isopropyl alcohol as a reducer. Brands like Windex work great to clean your airbrush, although they're a little harsh on the chrome, but they're not made to reduce paint. If I reduce this paint with almost pure isopropyl alcohol, you'll see what happens right here. You'll see that the alcohol reacts with the water and the pigment and the binder start to clump up. You don't ever want to put something like this in your airbrush. It's going to be an absolute nightmare to clean up. I know that some people actually use isopropyl alcohol in their reducer mixtures, and even Createx has a new line of reducer that has some isopropyl alcohol in it. I haven't tried this yet, and I'm sure they have some very smart chemists developing this, so I'm sure it works well, and you could probably get away with it with small amounts, mixed with a distilled pure water. For me though, to keep it simple and avoid any of this headache, I just stick with that distilled water. With that initial investment of the RODI system, I basically have a free reducer that I can make at all times. So I really hope this video was helpful, maybe insightful. You learned a thing or two about reducers. And again, if you have suggestions of what you like to use, please let me know down below. I'd love to hear it. I hope everyone's doing well, and I hope you guys have a great weekend. I'll see you back here next week.